Hello and welcome. Today I'd like to tell you about the timeline of Mad Max movies. Frankly, I'm making this video because I've seen too many people claiming that Mad Max movies do not have a solid timeline and that there is no continuity between them and all of the movies are just completely separate. That is simply not the case, and as you'll later find out, there is even a timeline connection between the original trilogy and Fury Road. But in order to understand it, we had to start with the first movie in the series, Mad Max. Released in 1979, the movie doesn't give us a lot of backstory. In fact, it doesn't give us anything except a short line a few years from now. So when does that movie take place and what's the backstory? Well, to understand all of this, we need to see how the movie was made. You see, Mad Max was not supposed to be a sci-fi movie set in a dystopian future at all. In fact,
Mad Max started off as a journalist in contemporary Melbourne.
Originally, the idea was to make a movie about a journalist going from one place of accident to another, and in the process of doing so, he would lose his humanity, empathy, and, he would become a shell of a man.
Look any longer out on that road and I'm one of them, a terminal crazy.
And that idea came from George Miller's own experience as a young doctor, observing seasoned doctors that were desensitized from years of working in profession. Miller just simply thought,
well, what would happen if it actually happened to you?
And also, what would it take to push that person over the edge? And so he created the early version of Mad Max. The movie was supposed to take place in contemporary Melbourne in the 1970s. This was a privately financed movie, and Miller and Kennedy just didn't have a lot of money at all. They wouldn't be able to afford to film in busy streets and buildings, and they wouldn't be able to pay for extras and get all the permissions. So to cut costs, they decided to film in abandoned buildings, outskirts of Melbourne, and back streets where grass would grow through the cracks in the pavement. On top of that, Miller and Kennedy were collecting crazy stories from their work as a doctor ambulance duo, and they wanted to include that in the script too. But turns out that the stories turned the script into some sort of crazed hyper version of reality. Also, George Miller just couldn't justify why Max's friends and family would die since he was just a journalist, so he decided to change the profession of the main character to a police officer. A reasonable choice given that families of police officers might get targeted by gangs too. The movie was changing shape dramatically, and Miller decided to give in and simply set the movie in the near dystopian future.
It just doesn't. I don't believe that it would be happening in the contemporary world. Let's exaggerate it. Let's set it a little bit in the future.
Okay, but when exactly in the future? Well, there are some clues in the movie. The first one is right at the very beginning. It says a few years from now. At the time of making Mad Max in 1977, this would have meant that Mad Max takes place somewhere in the 80s. Somewhere in the mid-80s, probably. But there's more. If you look closely, there's a date on one of the signs in the movie. And it says December 6, 1984, and it's written on the Highway 9 Sector 26 sign. And that's not even all. The MFP sign hanging on the Halls of Justice also has a date on it. It says established 1983, even though it's not visible in the movie, but the actual prop used in the movie shows exactly that year. Okay, so now we can assume that Mad Max takes place in the mid-80s, but what about the backstory? What happened to the world? Well, there is no backstory, really. At the time of writing Mad Max, the movie was supposed to be a contemporary movie, so they really didn't give it any kind of special backstory at all. However, the creators were directly inspired by the 1973 oil crisis that reached Australia. And this was a real event, which George Miller and Byron Kennedy saw with their own eyes, and they saw what fuel shortage did to the society and how quickly people turned against each other.
I remember very well that there was big restriction in Melbourne, and there were only a few petrol stations where only emergency services, nurses, ambulance drivers, police could get petrol. And in such a sedate, calm city as Melbourne, it took 10 days before the first shot was fired. And I wondered what would happen if it was 10 years.
And so they used that real event as an inspiration for the fuel shortage and anarchy in Mad Max. But other than that, there is really no backstory or world building. So to conclude, Mad Max takes place in the mid-1980s, and it doesn't really have a backstory because it was originally supposed to be a contemporary movie. Okay, so let's mark that on the timeline and move on to Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior. Mad Max became a success, and Miller noticed that people from different countries recognized Max as a mythological character. For the Japanese, Max was similar to a samurai, and in Nordic countries, he was compared to heroes from that mythology. And the French, for example, saw Max sort of like a character from a Western. This made Miller research mythological characters, and so he read a book entitled The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. In that book, Joseph Campbell outlined the character arc of a hero. And this is very important because Miller would then consciously use that knowledge and turn Max into this sort of wandering mythological hero who's remembered through campfire stories in all of the following Mad Max movies. Another thing that Miller wanted to change was the visual language of the movie. He would often quote Alfred Hitchcock, who said,
Alfred Hitchcock had a great saying, I try to make films where they don't have to read the subtitles in Japan.
and so he wanted the new Mad Max movie to be a very visual experience without a lot of dialogue. But in order to show that dystopian world to the audience and make them understand it without giving them barely any exposition, Miller had to lay down some serious foundation on top of which he would build that dystopian world from the ground up. Or in other words, he needed a detailed backstory for not only Mad Max 2, but for the first Mad Max as well. And here is where the serious backstory writing began. Meet Terry Hayes, the guy responsible for writing Mad Max novelization. Miller really liked that novelization, and so he hired Terry Hayes to help him write the script for Mad Max 2. Terry Hayes understood that in order to create a convincing dystopian world in Mad Max 2, he would have to base that backstory on reality, and also he would have to fill in the backstory for the first movie. So what inspired Terry Hayes to write that backstory? Well, a little experiment he did when he was working as a radio producer. He would put in fake news about a war breaking out in the Middle East in an actual real broadcast. And people listening to the radio were not aware that this was fake, and it caused quite a bit of panic. And this little fake news segment became the origin of the backstory for both Mad Max and Mad Max 2.
And I told him about my experience on the radio program. He said, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's say that's how the world ended.
The backstory was based on a real event. Again, this was an oil crisis, but this time around it was the 1979 oil crisis. And that was when real tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran took place. In the real world, those tensions ended peacefully, but in Terry Hayes' alternate reality, they led to a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which left all of the oil fields in the Middle East on fire. With that one event, Terry Hayes explained the lack of fuel in the world. And the rest was just a downward spiral all across the globe, which he explained in detail in a production document called The Preamble. In that document, it was outlined that after the war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, all of the countries in the world couldn't function without fuel. The UN was called to do something about it, but nothing could stop the avalanche. There were martial laws in Italy and Germany, and people went out on the streets, and governments started to collapse. Inner-city communications stopped, and whatever fuel convoys were left were ambushed and attacked by biker gangs. And that's when the Main Force Patrol was founded in Australia in 1983, as the last-ditch attempt to uphold the law on the roads. The events of Mad Max taking place in the mid-80s were the final days of the MFP, just before the complete collapse of the society as we know it. So, what happened between Mad Max and Mad Max 2? Well, things got worse. Electricity went out, food became scarce, banks and power plants got closed, MFP was disbanded, many officers went rogue, and ordinary people started to prey on each other for resources until it was just too dangerous to live in the cities altogether. So they fled out into the outback where they would have to roam for resources. And they would use homemade buggies, modified bikes, and cars to hunt alone, and later band into gangs. And people from different paths of life would end up in those gangs. People like ex-police officers, ex-military, punks, and skinheads. All of which were capable enough to survive, and they would often be banded together under the rule of one leader. Others would pack everything up and just leave, a sign of which you can see at the very beginning of Mad Max 2. Just look at the rig Max stumbles upon. I mean, the trailer is full of household items, plates, furniture. It's possible that this rig was part of a bigger convoy that left the city, but it was just not fit for the wasteland. The gunned down cars we see right before that look very normal as well. They also have household items in them, so they were probably part of that same convoy. Maybe they were going to the compound, who knows? And speaking of which, Papagallo was a CEO of the Seven Sisters Petroleum, an oil company gone bankrupt. Just as everyone else, he left the city, but he took the maps to the oil compound with him, a place where him and others would have the chance to start over again. Now, as for Max, he wandered into the wasteland too, but, he lost everything he got, and after the events of Mad Max, he became a shell of a man. Now, Mad Max 2 takes place just 3 years after the first movie. It's also very important to mention that Mad Max 2 does not take place after a nuclear holocaust. George Miller specifically stated that he did not want to set Mad Max 2 in a post-nuclear environment because it would create a lot of problems for the script. Fallout, radiation, disease, and lack of food and vegetation, poisoned water, and a completely barren landscape. Those are the reasons Mad Max 2 is not post-nuclear. In fact, it takes place in the final stages of decay of the society. However, Terry Hayes did not rule out the possibility of a limited nuclear exchange happening elsewhere in the world, in the Northern Hemisphere perhaps. But did it happen though? Well, it was never explicitly stated. For the Southern Hemisphere, however, and specifically Australia, the first 2 Mad Max movies do not take place after any kind of a nuclear attack. So let's look at the dates again. It's pretty straightforward so far. Mad Max takes place in the mid-80s. Mad Max 2 takes place 3 years after that, which means Mad Max 2 takes place in the late 80s, and if we stretch it, we could assume that it takes place in the 1990, just for simplicity's sake. And this round number would actually be helpful because some more dates will come up later on. Enter Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Now, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome takes place 15 years after Mad Max 2, which would mean that it takes place in 2005, roughly. Max is about 40 years old, and in the movie we find out that there was a nuclear apocalypse. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a detailed production document showing what happened between Mad Max 2 and Beyond Thunderdome, although I'm 100% sure that a detailed backstory exists because Miller absolutely needs it to build the worlds we see in those movies. But since we don't know when the nuclear strike happened, we're gonna have to listen to those kids covered in clay and see what they have to say.
Stop the noise, man! Stop the noise!
According to the kids in the Crack in the Earth, aka, the waiting ones,
Who's the waiting ones?
it all started with the epoxy clips full of pain. Clearly, they mean the nuclear holocaust, but since we know that it didn't happen before Mad Max and Mad Max 2, it must have happened after those 2 movies. Now, this is when their story gets a little weird. Let's assume the nuclear apocalypse happened and the nuclear winter came, and then they say Captain Walker took the people on a plane and crashed the plane. So that must mean they somehow survived the nuclear attack and managed to get enough fuel and a working plane only to get up in the air and crash it in the desert. There's no way of arguing that story because this is the only one we've got. So let's just assume that's what happened, although frankly it just sounds kind of ridiculous. So the plane crashed, the survivors settled in the Crack in the Earth and started to, rebuild civilization, if you know what I mean. Okay, they made babies, all right? And the eldest kid we see in Beyond Thunderdome is Savannah, who's supposed to be 16 years old. So let's do the math. Beyond Thunderdome takes place 15 years after Mad Max 2. Savannah is 16. That must mean that Savannah was born around the time of Mad Max 2, which was pre-nuclear holocaust. But also Savannah was too young to remember the nuclear holocaust and the plane crash, which would mean that all of it happened shortly after Mad Max 2. Now, let's look at the dates. The message we see on the wall in the Crack in the Earth shows a date when Captain Walker left with a search party. Again, the date is obscured, but we can see that they left that place on September 10th, 1990 X, we don't know. Since Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome takes place in 2005, and adults left sometime in the mid-90s, we can assume that the kids were there without adult supervision for about 10 years. And at least according to what we see in the movie. Which always made me wonder what kind of adults would leave all the kids to fend for themselves. After all, the kids say that there was this one big search party and they left, and that was that. But wait, that's not what really happened. Although in the movie we find out that Captain Walker left that place with others, the original version of the script reveals that Captain Walker's search party was only the first one. After that, there was a second one, a slightly smaller group of people, and they never came back either. And then there was even a smaller third group and a fourth group with just a couple of people. And finally, the fifth search party, which consisted of just one, the eldest person of the tribe, Savannah. She was the designated search party in that movie, following in the tradition of Captain Walker. And now you know what she was doing out in the desert and why she was so happy she found Max, thinking it's Captain Walker who promised to come back. They really thought it was Captain Walker after so many years of people going in search of him and the civilization. It kind of helps you to understand why those kids act in such strange ways. Unfortunately, in the final movie, the whole plot wasn't fleshed out enough for us to understand, and so that plot with the kids just gets a lot of flack. So let's round it up. First, we have the war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Possibly the war started in 1979, just like in the real world it would have. Then the world collapses. MFP is established in 1983 in Australia. And then Mad Max takes place somewhere in the mid-80s. After that, people flee the cities and start roaming the outback, and they form gangs. And Mad Max 2 takes place 3 years after Mad Max, in late 80s or in 1990, if we want to keep it simple. Nuclear apocalypse happens shortly after Mad Max 2. Sometime in the mid-90s, Captain Walker leaves the crack in the earth, and Beyond Thunderdome takes place in 2005, which is 15 years after Mad Max 2. So, having said all of that, there's a reason why Miller builds those huge backstories but never reveals them. He simply wants people to be guessing, and it makes those movies that much more compelling. Which doesn't change the fact that in order to convey his visual style properly, he has to come up with solid backstories for everything, and believe me, what I've explained here is just the tip of the iceberg. And Miller has backstories for all the characters in the movies, and his obsession with world building peaked with Fury Road, where so much additional material was written that 2 additional Mad Max scripts were written as a byproduct. It's just that he doesn't want us to see any of it, and he puts it all through this mythology grinder and further blurs the clarity with third-person storytelling, which leaves a lot of leeway and room for any kind of interpretation. That's what makes people come up with crazy theories about those movies, but, truth be told, there is a continuity to all of those movies, even between the original trilogy and Fury Road, which I'll discuss in the next video. So, stay tuned and wait for my next video where I'll be discussing exactly that.